Now in the last video I stopped working on those steps, but there was still a lot of epoxy work left to do, so that's what I'm doing here. I made those steps out of plywood, and it's always a good idea to seal up the edges, so I'm using straight up epoxy for that. Since I have so many round corners going on here, I thought it would fit the picture if I smoothen out the inner edges of those pockets. And for that I really don't need the high strength of a high density filler, so I'm using the 407, which is a low density filler from West System. It should be much easier to sand too. Unfortunately I lost the footage of what exactly I did there, but basically I put everything in a tube and put a bead in the corner, smoothened that out. And at the same time I tried to take care of some imperfections. For example, there were a couple ugly knots on the plywood backing. Basically I tried to smoothen everything out. Unfortunately, this did not go the way I wanted it at all. I think there's a couple of things that went wrong here. First is that I ran out of filler material. What I tried to do here is producing an easy to sand fairing compound. And for that purpose, you usually aim for a peanut butter consistence. Mine was a little bit more runny. So you can see on certain spots the epoxy is sagging. The other thing is, I think I messed up the ratio between hardener and epoxy itself. The reason why I say that is if I put my fingernail to it, I can feel the surface is a little bit like rubber. And after 3 days of hardening, that's not really acceptable. It does get colder in this area, so that influences the hardening time a little bit, but not by that ratio. So I made myself a lot of work here because it's going to be a pain in the butt to sand down. But on a big project like that, mistakes happen, and there's really just one way to move forward. So I'm tired of staring at it, so I'm gonna try to tackle this now. Now, out of all the things, I really hate sanding the most, so this was quite a bummer. I tried to use the random orbital sander for as much as I could, but I kind of reached the limits pretty quick there. After that, I switched to a disc sander for my drill, but even with that, I wasn't really able to access the sidewalls. For that, I kind of needed a drum sander, and since I don't own one, I had to improvise one. And that's what I used to make one. A long socket, a bolt, a couple nuts, some sandpaper, and some spray adhesive. Now this worked surprisingly well, but after all that sanding I still had some pretty ugly dents left. Now I ran out of that epoxy filler, so that wasn't really an option to fill them up anymore, so I used that instead. I know a lot of people think very poorly about Bondo, but it actually makes an excellent wood filler. So that's what I'm using it here for, to finish this finally up. And after a lot more sanding, I was ready to move on. Now at this point I was way too curious to see how this is going to look like in the end, so I decided to throw on 2 coats of an acrylic latex primer and sealer. Now that is not going to be the final color, but it will give me a good idea of how it's going to look like. And even though the whole thing was way too much work for just a bunch of steps, I was very happy and pleased with the look of it in the end. Alright, time to move on. My next goal is to get part of the insulation and paneling done. I like to use a cheap Japanese saw to cut those insulation boards. That seems to work pretty well. In this small section of the boat, I plan on having a raised floor with a tiny bathroom on one side on top of it. That gives me some room for some form of water tank right underneath it. And since I don't want the tanks or the pump to sit right on the foam, I try to cover this whole section with 1/4" plywood. Now, because all of this will be super hard to access later, I purposely try to puzzle in smaller pieces so I could get them out again if I need to. Out of all the places, this is probably the one that, with some bad luck, has the most potential to see some form of water damage, so it's nice to be able to work on it if I have to. By the way, the entire inside of the hull of the boat is sealed with epoxy and polyurethane, so it really would be just this layer of plywood that would take any damage, if at all. As you can imagine, this step was very time consuming. There was a lot of measuring and cutting going on and climbing in and out of the boat 1,000 times, but I got it done eventually. Now with all of this done, now I'm ready to work on that raised floor. And I pre-cut a whole bunch of plywood already. Before I install that though, I will have to stiffen up the framing here a little bit. And you might be able to see those clamps there. They're just in here to help me to position those cross members a little bit better. There was a measuring difference of 1/8 of an inch. And by clamping one side and spreading the other, I was able to adjust that, so not that big of a deal. Anyways, I'm excited for that floor, so let's get it done.